Hello, my name is Thomas. Welcome to British Culture Albion Never Dies. T is for Tolkien. This is a very special episode. To prepare for it, I first of all read The Hobbit more than 30 times, at least once a year, since it was read to me as a child, first by my brother and my father in turns, and then I read it myself when I was given a copy. I've read it in English and in Turkish. Amazingly, the poems that go throughout the book in English were translated into Turkish both meaningfully, and they work in Turkish as poems as well as they do in English. It's a masterclass in translation, something I think J.R. Tolkien would greatly appreciate. Of course, I've also read The Lord of the Rings twice, once at primary school, once as an adult, and I dip into it from time to time. The Silmarillion I've read certainly at least twice. Again, I think I might have read it a few more times, probably more than The Lord of the Rings, but of course it is ever so slightly shorter. I've also listened to the 13-hour BBC radio adaptation of The Lord of the Rings. That, of course, came out in 1981, and I was able to get hold of a copy on cassette tape so I could listen to it again and again. It's got an amazing cast. Ian Holm as Frodo, who would later play old Bilbo in the Peter Jackson movies. John Le Mesurier played old Bilbo. He's, of course, best known as Uncle Arthur in Dad's Army, but in The Lord of the Rings he plays it less as a comedic role and with much, much more melancholy. The future star Bill Nighy plays Sam. He's credited by the BBC as William Nighy before he became Bill Nighy. Aragorn, played by Robert Stevens, one of my favourite versions of Sherlock Holmes in Billy Wilder's 1970 The Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, which incidentally had Christopher Lee as Mycroft Holmes. Christopher Lee, of course, played Saruman in the Peter Jackson versions. And Gandalf the Grey, or Gandalf the White, was played by Michael Hordern, who's pretty well known in the UK, mainly as the narrator for Paddington, the TV show. I think 60 episodes between 76 and 93, and of course repeated endlessly. If you listen to the American version of this, it has different narrators, so you don't get Paddington Bear narrating Lord of the Rings. Anyway, this is another bit of preparation I did, especially for this episode. Of course, I've watched the Peter Jackson films in theatre, and then I watched the extended editions and every single DVD bonus extra of those extended editions. Yes, I did watch the animated versions as well, from the 70s. And specifically, I did watch a couple of documentaries on the life of Tolkien. One from The People's Profile, which is a great YouTube channel which does bios of many great, good and terrible people. And there was a 1996 documentary narrated by Judi Dench, which, again, shed so much life on Tolkien. You can find it on YouTube. I won't put the links because these things can be taken down so easily, but it is a great documentary and has interviews with all of Tolkien's sons. And of course, as a child, I lived in Worcestershire, the inspiration for the Shire and the real life location of Bag End in Dormston, which was the farm which belonged to Tolkien's aunt, where he stayed in 1923. It's about 15 minutes from Stratford-Upon-Avon, which is of course where Shakespeare was born. All of that preparation specifically for this one podcast episode. And I've got some books handy by Tolkien. I have 2 copies of The Lord of the Rings. One, which is the whole book, all as one book, and one which splits it into 7 volumes. I don't have it as a trilogy, as that's not what he originally intended. It's how it was originally produced, but that was due to paper shortages and rationing and so on when it was first printed. But it wasn't the intention. In fact, it is written in 6 volumes, with a 7th as the appendix, and then it's all collated into one solid book, which, importantly for me, was genuinely bound in red. So that's all the preparation. I hope that this episode meets the demands. So, what inspired J.R. Tolkien? Interestingly, in some ways he was inspired by loss. 2 great breaks in English mythological kind of history. The first, of course, is 1066, which is a great dramatic event, which is the Norman conquest. Of course, a real event, not a mythological event, but it had an effect on our mythology, which I'll delve into in a moment. First, I shall tell you the second. The second great break in English mythology comes with the Industrial Revolution, which happened faster than folk tales could be captured. Before the Industrial Revolution, the majority of people lived in small villages, and stories were simply passed down organically, generation to generation. But as people moved to cities, what had once been small village identities became absorbed into great city identities, and simply a great many tales were lost. Germany, of course, followed Britain in urbanising, and as they urbanised, the Brothers Grimm travelled around making notes of all the great stories and all the little villages there. By the time the English writers tried to do the same, too much had already been lost. So, I shall delve into the one and then the other. 1066 and all that, the memorable date in English history, had a profound effect on England, its history, its language, and its mythology. Before then, you have the Germanic Anglo-Saxons, and studying them, the Old English, was J.R. Tolkien's life's work. So it's really worth delving into. In many ways, I think the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, which is one of the key sources of information for that time, has a comparison to the Red Book of Westmarch, which within the world that Tolkien created, that's the source he's drawing for. He had his kind of in-world persona as a translator, a historian, and when people wrote to him with questions, he'd often kind of write out something and give them multiple interpretations of the West Book of Westmarch, which had been collated from various sources. Again, I'll delve into that with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles a bit, and again, that's part of why I like having my Lord of the Rings copy bound in red. The Normans wiped away all of that in 1066. They took out the leaders, the decision makers, the holders of cultural capital. And one of the most interesting effects you can see on English culture is in language. So in many languages, the meat and the animal are the same word. So for example, in Chinese the word for sheep is yang, and the word for lamb is yang rou. You see how it works together. But of course in English the two words are very different, because sheep comes from the German word, and lamb and mouton comes from French. House, of course, is Germanic. Mansion, maison, is the French word. Then you have the eradication of Germanic titles. We don't have jarls anymore, and the replacement with Old French for all kind of political terms. So for example, parliament, which I've talked about very recently, parliament is from parler, to speak. Interesting. In Russian it would be duma, from the verb to think. Anyway, we also have a profound influence on French romantic literature. So we think of Arthurian romances, but that of course is the French influence. I mean, I've been doing a podcast on English culture for a year or two, and generally when I've asked people, what do you think is Britishness or Englishness, I haven't heard people say romantic a great deal. But we have all these Arthurian romances, an important part of our mythology. It comes from the French. It comes after 1066. So again, a major change in our mythology, our cultural landscape. Now again, helping me prepare for this episode, I have actually read the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, hard-going in some places, but first, what are they? There is no better source, really, than the British Library for the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. This is how they describe them. The term Anglo-Saxon Chronicle refers to a series of annalistic chronicles arranged by year, which were written primarily in Old English between the 9th and 12th centuries. These annals record information on a huge variety of subjects, from major battles and Viking invasions to famines and agricultural issues, from ecclesiastical restructurings to notes on the death of notable people from across Britain. Some annals even include poems about kings and battles, although all the annals share some core text, the so-called common stock, which seems to have been compiled at some point during the reign of Alfred the Great. Each text of the chronicle has its own variations, omissions, and additions. It is therefore perhaps more correct to speak of Anglo-Saxon chronicles as Simon Keyes has suggested. There are multiple different copies of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle A is the earliest surviving copy. It contains entries written at different times between the 9th and early 11th centuries, with a 12th century continuation. It's sometimes known as the Parker Chronicle, after Matthew Parker, Archbishop of Canterbury, who gave large parts of his collection of manuscripts to the University of Cambridge. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle B, copied in the late 10th century. This chronicle covers the period between 60 BC and 977 AD, and it's sometimes referred to as the Abingdon Chronicle, or the Abingdon Chronicle 1, as there's a few variations, the last entries referring to Abingdon, along with C and D. It also contains a series of annals known as the Mercian Register, which recount the activities of Ethelred, Lady of the Mercians in the early 10th centuries. Between these different versions, you get very different emphasis placed on places and people referring to those places, which is part of what makes it so interesting. It gives a clue, of course, to where it was written. Where you live is always the most important place. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle D was copied in the late 11th century, and there's added information about Worcester and York. And then there's E, which was copied at Peterborough, currently at Oxford in Bodleian Library. There's also F, written in the late 11th century at Christ Church, Canterbury. All these manuscripts have had varied and colourful histories, which are reflected in the medieval editions and early modern annotations scattered throughout. And in the modern period, some of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle manuscripts have been bound with other interesting texts, which have also been digitised by the British Library as well. I find that really interesting. Of course, the go-to bit is the description of the Battle of Hastings found in one of the 11th century English chronicles. Count William came from Normandy to Pevensey on Michaelmas Eve, 28th September 1066, and as soon as they were able to move on, they built a castle at Hastings. King Harold was informed of this, and he assembled a large army and came against him with the hoary apple tree. And William came against him by surprise, before his army was drawn up in battle array. But the king nevertheless fought hard against him, with the men who were willing to support him, and there were heavy casualties on both sides. There King Harold was killed, and Earl Leafwine his brother, and Earl Garth his brother, and many good men, and the French remained masters of the field, even as God granted it to them, because of the sins of the people. And always after that, it grew much worse. May the end be good when God wills. That is from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, translated by Dorothy Whitelock, because of course in 1,000 years English has changed a very great deal. There is an art to translation. So this is one of the factual accounts, and the creation of this account, which feeds into copies, and the copies then have additional information that are important to each of the locations where it was copied or where it was being sent to. Then you have extra information folded in or written in the margins over time, and it gets bound and rebound. All of this informs, well, Tolkien's study, but then it feeds into his fiction as well. The fiction of the era was a particular interest of him, and I would say Beowulf is the most famous Old English poem. I love the translation by Seamus Healy, who's in Northern Ireland, much like Tolkien's friend C.S. Lewis. So here is part of Beowulf by Seamus Healy. So, the Spear Danes in days gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns. There was Shield Chafeson, scourge of many tribes, wrecker of mead benches, rampaging among foes. This terror of the hall troops had come far. A foundling to start with, he would flourish later on, as his powers waxed and his worth was proved. In the end, each clan on the outer-lying coasts beyond the Whale Road had to yield to him and begin to pay tribute. That was one good king. Afterwards, a boy-child was born to shield, a cub in the yard, a comfort sent by God to that nation. He knew what they had told, the long times and troubles they'd come through, without a leader, so the Lord of Life, the glorious Almighty, made this man renowned. Shield had fathered a famous son. Beor's name was known through the north. And a young prince must be prudent like that, giving freely while his father lives, so that afterwards, in age, when fighting starts, steadfast companions will stand beside him and hold the line. Behaviour that's admired is the path to power among people everywhere. That is from Beowulf, perhaps the foremost example of Anglo-Saxon literature, something to which Tolkien dedicated his life to. Most famously, of course, at Oxford University, he spent a short time at Leeds, where he met Eric Valentine Gordon in 1922. Tolkien found him as a friend and as a colleague. They both shared a love of studying medieval philology. The two men worked together on an edition of Sir Gawain the Green Knight, published in 1925, which was the standard text for many years. They also collaborated on articles, book chapters, a broadcast for BBC Radio. Perhaps most importantly, Tolkien and Gordon set up a Viking club for Leeds undergraduates who could join them in medieval wordplay and versification. When Tolkien went to the University of Oxford, Gordon maintained the club, and Tolkien continued to send drafts of songs for it. I think this is actually hugely important as it unlocks the world of Viking literature to Tolkien, who, having been brought up in, well, the Anglo-Saxon areas south of Danelaw, he would have grown up with King Alfred as his hero, the founder of what we'd now call England, because, of course, the north of England became governed for a time by the Vikings and ended up with a very different tradition. You might read some of the north-south divide that still exists to the Danelaw and, I guess, the Anglo-Saxon bits of England. Anyway, Tolkien had an interesting upbringing, which I feel has been covered wonderfully in many, many other biographies. A sad upbringing in some ways, having lost both parents as a child, but one where nature played a vital role. He didn't see, for example, a motor car until his teenage years. He grew up in the West Midlands, as I've mentioned. Malvern very closely matches the descriptions of the Shire, even down to trees and wildlife, and the Severn River, for me, seemed very reminiscent of what the Hobbits called the Brandywine, and of course the elves refer to as the Branduin. That love of philology, the origin of language, really playing into his kind of fictitious languages there. Of course, in the First World War, he saw the application of industrialisation to warfare and lost a great many of his friends at the Battle of the Somme, which he took part in, and many, many others. Ultimately, he was the last left of his childhood writing societies, and the return home struck him equally as he saw his area of what is now part of Birmingham utterly change. It had been very, very rural, and he's written about this himself, of how strongly it was changed, and it's perhaps one of the very few direct inspirations of a section of the book inspired by something in his life, which is of course the scouring of the Shire. In the documentaries I referred to, the one narrated by Judi Dench, one of his sons talks about how he believed that automation doesn't remove slavery, it simply puts it out of sight. The son keen to say he was no eccentric about this. He lived in the modern world. He indeed obtained an early voice recorder in the very, very, very early days of such things, and there is a poetry reading by Tolkien himself on YouTube. Again, these things, I hesitate to put links because they can be taken down so easily, but it's Forth the Eolan Gas, and it's a wonderful poem, as read by the author. I think it's a very special thing. So he was aware of these things. I wonder if he was alive today, perhaps he would have been interested in fair trade products, and of course the illusion of kind of a connected, smart world and so on is something I'm pretty interested in, having lived and worked in the disconnected bits, where factories very much exist and the poor conditions within them certainly do. Tolkien, as I say, he wrote and wrote. He wrote for these writing societies. He might write one thing for the BBC. He did publish a book with another fella, but he actually had very little interest in publishing. He had an interest in writing, and he wrote a huge, huge amount. But often what we see in terms of Tolkien's work getting to our bookshelves is often his immense creativity helped by somebody else, honestly, more interested in helping the book get out there. And so, for example, it said, I believe The Hobbit happened to be seen by somebody at the university who passed it on to a friend who was at a publishing house, who then passed it on, and so on. And, of course, he was an artist. He painted watercolours, and his drawings are wonderful. He was very, very creative. I work at an academic publishing company, and I deal with academics a great deal, so I've heard tales of how he would demand revision after revision after revision, which of course is because Tolkien was an immense perfectionist. I certainly feel for the publishers in that it's not always as straightforward as it may seem, even and perhaps especially in the electronic era. It should be a simple thing. You can change it on a Word document so easily, so why can't you change it in a typesetting process so easily? Of course, the answer is use any app and tell me if it's as simple as it should be. And of course, he disagreed with splitting Lord of the Rings into 3 volumes. It had to be done due to paper rationing. Those were the realities of printing. I can certainly sympathise with his disagreement over the 2 titles. The Fellowship of the Ring seems a good title to me, but the 2 Towers raises the question of which 2 towers are the towers being referred to, and of course the Return of the King gives away a certain element of the final book. So I can see why he disagreed with those titles, but sometimes the publisher just has to get stuff done. But Tolkien's academic work, his lectures, especially Game of the Green Knight, and on fairy tales, became absolutely renowned. I would say, by the way, that many academics are not so keen on print publishing. It happens to be a part of modern academic KPIs, key performance indicators. It demands that they do this. Sadly, in some cases, it can lead them astray. It leads to the phenomenon of something called paper mills, essentially junk research being churned out by semi-fake publishers, and certainly fake reviewers, and indeed fictitious reviewers. I've had to investigate some of these, which has been very, very interesting, and certainly I'm sad that this is something people feel the need to do. But as I say, it's not every academic who really wants to throw out a book. It can sometimes be the least interesting part of their job to them, just narrowing down all their great research into the way that frankly a book publisher needs. Anyway, it is well known that bringing The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings to a final format was extremely difficult and involved a number of back and forths between Tolkien and publishers. And one letter that he wrote to Milton Waldman, who was an American publisher, and like Tolkien, a veteran of the First World War, someone who was initially interested in publishing both The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion, but as many, balked at the length, and was also called by his colleagues. One letter is particularly well known, and has been included in a number of kind of letter compilations, but it gives a real insight into Tolkien, so I'm gonna read this one out. I really, really like it. Tolkien wrote, "Do not laugh. But once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the larger founded on the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendour from the vast backcloths which I could dedicate simply to England, to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the northwest, meaning Britain, and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the east, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, that fair, elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine, ancient Celtic things. It should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in a scheme and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. I find it a really interesting letter, and a lot of people look to this letter as it gives a real insight into Tolkien's thought process in creating, well, what we call the world of Middle-earth. I shall end by talking about Tolkien's poetry. Lord of the Rings has over 100 poems, ranging from fun to epics. Let's start with the fun. Ho, 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 to the bottle I go, to heal my heart and drown my woe. Rain may fall and wind may blow, and many miles be still to go, but under a tall tree I will lie, and let the clouds go sailing by. Another poem I particularly like is one that is actually repeated at the end of The Hobbit, near the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. In various versions, it's a song sung by Bilbo and Frodo. Slight different variations, but it's one that I really like. Roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon. Roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone, turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with eager feet, until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands meet. The road goes ever on and on, down from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, and I must follow if I can, pursuing it with weary feet, until it joins some larger way, where many paths and errands feet, and whither then I cannot say. The road goes ever on and on, out from the door where it began. Now far ahead the road has gone, let others follow if they can. Let them a journey new begin, but I at last with weary feet will turn towards the lighted inn, my evening rest and sleep to meet. Still round the corner there may wait a new road or a secret gate, and though I oft have passed them by, a day will come at last when I shall take the hidden paths that run west of the moon, east of the sun. I shall finish with one of my favourite sections from The Lord of the Rings. It's the section where Merry and Pippin, Frodo's cousins, come across an Ent, the shepherd of the trees. Sheep get like their shepherd, and shepherd like their sheep, but it is closer and quicker with Ents. And the Ent Treebeard explains the loss, not the death or the passing, but the loss of the Entwives. He says, "The elves made many songs concerning the search of the Ents, and some of the songs passed into the tongues of men. But while we made no songs about it, being content to chant their beautiful names when we thought of the Entwives, we believe that we may meet again in a time to come. and perhaps we shall find somewhere a land where we can live together and both be content. But it is foreboded that this will only be when we have both lost all that we now have. And it may well be that time is drawing near at last. For if Sauron destroyed the gardens of old, the enemy today seems likely to wither all the woods. There was an elvish song that spoke of this, or at least so I understand it. It used to be sung up and down the great river. It was never an Entish song, mark you. It would have been a very long song in Entish, but we know it by heart, and hum it now and again. This is how it runs in your tongue. When spring unfolds the beechen leaf, and sap is in the bough, when light is on the wildwood stream, and wind is on the brow, when stride is long, and breath is deep, and keen the mountain air, come back to me, and say my land is fair. The Entwise reply, when spring is come to garth and field, and corn is in the blade, when blossom like a shining snow is on the orchard laid, when shower and sun and pon the earth with fragrance fill the air, I'll linger here and will not come, because my land is fair. The Ents reply, when summer lies upon the world, and in a noon of gold, beneath the roof of sleeping leaves, the dreams of trees unfold, when woodland halls are green and cool, and wind is in the west, come back to me, and say my land is best. The poem finishes with both. Together. Together we will take the road that leads into the west, and far away we'll find a land where both our hearts may rest. Treebeard ended his song, that's how it goes. It is elvish, of course, light-hearted, quick-worded, and soon over. I dare say it is fair enough. But the Ents could say more on their side if they had time. But now I'm going to stand up and take a little sleep. Where will you stand? We usually lie down to sleep, said Mary. We should be all right where we are. Lie down to sleep, said Treebeard. Why, of course you do. That's forgetting. Singing that song put me in mind of old times. Almost thought I was talking to young Entings, I did. Well, you can lie on a bed. I am going to stand in the rain. Good night.